The first thing I wanted to say is that this exhibition is probably the most mobile and transformative exhibition we've ever had in the gallery. And this is not simply because every one of these objects can have so many different states of being open, partly or entirely, into something other than what we see right now on the walls, but also because we've had the privilege of exploring on these walls the mobility and the difference of works that Nakai had. We've had an opportunity to install one of his largest installations that you could see on that picture here in the space that came out from the wall spilling down here, but also to look at other works that were pre his Italian period. And I will explain now what I mean by that by saying a few biographical words about Nakai. So Katsumi Nakai is an artist that was born in Japan, in a town near Osaka in 1927. He passed away only in 2013 and spent his life between two countries primarily, which are Japan and Italy. During the pre-war and during the war years, Nakai was determined to become an artist, but within a context of, and I'm sure, by the way, that Lena will be able to clarify that a lot better than I can, but within a context of a certain artistic trend or artistic direction that was developing in the country and in the region in particularly, of which we best know from a group of artists that we recognize as the Gutai artists. A group of artists whose practice really had a lot to do with the exploration of action and movement and a process as part of the result, or as an expression that finds its manifestation in the artistic result. And if we move to the next slide, we will see a very, very rare work that we have managed to obtain for the first iteration of the show and to look at and to have here in London, which is a work that Nakai does in 1950, so still while he's in Japan, and we're talking about just after the war. And these paintings, which in a very charming way, we've heard his wife used to call the vroom vroom paintings. I'll explain why, because if you look closer, and if we move to the next slide and see a detail of this painting, what Nakai would do is he would apply layers of paint onto a sanding machine, which he would then apply onto the canvas in this very, very expressive gesture that looks like someone has been slaughtered possibly on the surface, or but actually coming close to it, suddenly these beautiful circles appear, a sense of movement, of rhythm, of so many things happening on that canvas that seem to have been a lot more constrained or geometric than one would seem at first. And if we go one slide back, can we do that? Yes, you can almost see the warped sense of the stretcher looking also in a weird, not entirely rectangular surface. And we've had a number of discussions with the conservator who looked at this painting, and there is a chance that this is actually even intentional in the process of the making of the work. This same artist, who's now gathering a group of artists around him by the name Tekaikai, which was another group, not the Gutai, less known to us today, nevertheless feels like he is working and thinking in Japan, but would very much like to go to North America, to the United States, where he sees and hears about new trends in art in the post-war years that he would very much like to explore. And he decides on the way to leave Japan and travel through Europe, visiting some of the places he thought would be essential for him to see before he heads west. He goes through Greece, to France and Italy, and in Italy he arrives in Milan with a few letters of introduction that were handed to him by other artists and people in the Japanese art community in Osaka, and he suddenly finds that he is a lot more interested in what's happening in that city than he thought he would be initially, and his stay there extends and extends, and soon enough he actually calls back to his wife and his 6-year-old daughter to come and move and live with him. Now, after his arrival to Japan, Nakai really completely, you would think at first, alters his practice. If we move 2 slides ahead, we can see one of the earliest works that is happening. We're talking about Nakai settles in Japan in 1964, in Italy. Yes, not Japan. He settles in Milan in 1964, and suddenly those round shapes, those circles, those very, very abstract forms start gaining a very different life on the canvas. He doesn't let go of the canvas, but he starts using and applying and incorporating pieces of thin plywood or panel onto which he's painting. If you see this painting, which is quite a small painting, by the way, it's not far off from the size that you're seeing it on the screen, has paint over canvas and then wood panels with this paint that start emerging outwards. One of the problems he's facing very early on is that he's fascinated by two very different contexts, at least according to his testimony. One of them is his wanderings and discovery of Christian and European iconography, wandering into churches, looking at altarpieces, at a lot of painting that is Renaissance or medieval painting even. And on the other hand, being surrounded and finding a link to a gallery in Milan in which a number of very interesting contemporary artists are operating, some of which you can see in the adjacent room, including Lucio Fontana, Paolo Scheggi, another Japanese artist who he comes to learn about his existence only when he comes to Italy, and that's Nabuya Abe, who was a very interesting, 10 years older than Nakai, living in Rome but working in Milan and exhibiting in Milan a lot. And one of the problems he's facing is that he's really interested by the way that these artists are looking at how to open painting into something that expresses space, three-dimensionality, movement, action, but doing it in a much more constrained, much more constructed way than he was doing in Japan. And he starts thinking about the idea of opening up as something that he can only find expression to in painting. Now, this is an assumption, not a piece of knowledge, but it seems like one of the things that come up from the little information we have is that he was also looking for a way to open up in other ways than language, because one of his problems were that he did not, for whatever reason, never really learned Italian. But he ended up living for more than 30 years in Milan, working, exhibiting, showing, being part of the group, being written about by so many members of that group that was working around his gallery, but also but nevertheless never really picking up Italian. His daughter, however, and his wife who settled with him became much more Italian than he was in many ways. And if we move to the next slide, so this is an iPhone photograph we took today of the wall behind you, because we, in a different iteration again to what it is right now, but in which you see the works as they are now, conserved, closed, disciplined. But if you move to the next slide, you can see how the exhibition looked like until this morning, which is where these creatures, these objects, were allowed to set free their entire spectrum of movement. Nakai comes up with this idea that his paintings can open up but can be played with, and that the legacy or that the agency of activating them should not entirely be his. The hand that you see as a form of a fist right behind you in the space right now can open up in all different sorts of ways. It could be a full open hand, it could have one finger up, it could have different ways. Many of these paintings, as this one that you see right here behind us, contain a canvas behind them, and this is one thing that Nakai really insists on. His paintings are paintings. They're not sculptures, they're not objects, they could be object paintings, but they are very much essentially paintings that misbehave, that open up, that change, that could be moved. I don't know if we have any more slides in this. No. So this was just kind of a very brief introduction to explain who Nakai is, and maybe to conclude it, I will just say one more thing. Having gained a reputation in the Italian art scene, and one of the things we see is in some of the catalogs that come up in the 70s and 80s, so many of his contemporaries write about his work. He nevertheless never finds home there. His titles for his works during this period of staying in Italy are all bound to the Italian language. He calls most of these works that you see around here l'oggetto si sboccia, which means the object is unfolding, only that this title contains also a mistake in Italian, because si sboccia, the reflexive form, is not used. You'd say l'oggetto sboccia. But this mistake probably contains a lot of what Nakai was, a very independent person in that sense. For example, he would also date these works not by the date, but by the age he was when he would paint them. And in the 1980s, being this odd bird, he actually finds suddenly a moment in his career where he feels like he should go back to Japan. And he starts making more and more work in Japan. The work he makes in Japan he calls hiraku, which also means opening, but in Japanese. The titles always tell us whether they were painted in Italy or in Japan. And gradually he returns to Japan, and in so many ways, perhaps maybe remains on kind of the cusp between never really materializing fully his career in Italy in the terms of its legacy and afterlife, nor ever really being considered a Japanese artist in Japan. So with all this very lengthy introduction to the artist that I'm sure only few of us know of and know of well, I'd like to ask Brandon here to start by telling a little bit maybe about what is the broader context or art historical context of Nakai's work if we look at Italy and if we look at North America, where he was aiming to get to during this time.
Thank you, Yuval. I think maybe is the word. I'll do my best to fill in some of the spaces in what Yuval has said, and just expand a bit. Worth mentioning that he came from a family in Osaka. His father was a priest in the Shinto temple, and the young Nakai was intent on joining the army. This is in the days of the emperor, before the end of the Second World War. And his switch to a career in art was maybe surprising, maybe not, in retrospect. His father died in 1951, and it was quite late when he, Nakai, became a student at the age of 26 and remained a student for quite a long time. This was at a time which Lena will talk about later, when the well-known Gutai formation was doing its thing in the same part of Japan, but not that close to Katsumi, and the extent to which Gutai became very celebrated, whereas Katsumi Nakai's work did not for a while. It remains to be kind of speculated over. What is the link between these two important things? It's not terribly clear yet. Yes, he did exhibit with a rather hand-to-mouth, quickly put-together organization called Tekekai, which translates as the Iron Cockerels, although Japanese speakers have argued about this for a long time. I mean, the translation of the Japanese Tekekai into, maybe Lena will disagree with this, but this is what the artist's daughter tells me. And that was in 1958. And here, yes, we do have something of an American context emerging, probably, because I think, although I don't know for sure, that in the mid to late 50s, the international news in art was not totally, but predominantly American, in the field anyway of contemporary art, written in English. Anybody who's a student in those years would be reading the art magazines from New York. And even if they didn't understand them, they would surely be getting to know about the latter days, actually, not the early days, but the latter days of the school known as the New York School. You know about Jackson Pollock, who died in 1956, but also other maestro of that period, including de Kooning, Rothko, all the well-known figures who practiced this kind of informal method of working, which, by the way, have links that as many of you, I think, know, is not that far in spirit to some of the work we see from Gutai. Well, he ends up in Milan. We do not actually know his reasons for wanting to go to America. I don't think we do. We can speculate that it was to New York, but in fact he never in his life went to New York or even got to America, and he seemed to be very happy with his arrival in Milan and his range of contacts that he developed there. It is very peculiar that he never entered the Italian culture linguistically. So we take it to mean that conversations between him and young Italian artists would have been fairly monosyllabic, maybe gestural, maybe translated with the help, interrelated with the help of his wife, who by then did speak Italian. But you can have to get the picture of somebody not linguistically in the culture, but certainly in the city. Now, just briefly, perhaps one of the main figures of the young artist group in Milan at that time was an artist called Lucio Fontana, who was not himself young by that time. He had spent some time in South America and in Argentina especially. And this is relevant because Fontana himself, who devised this concept of spatialism or spaziolismo, was actually originated in South America in the late 1940s, where a group in Buenos Aires called MADI certainly were adept in varying the spatial and temporal parameters of the work of art by using such things as shaped canvases, hinged to some extent, paintings and sculptures which had hinges in them which could be set in different positions on the surface, that kind of thing. So the idea of spatialism, which Fontana then translated to Milan when he arrived there in the 50s, was basically this, that we need to get away from the concept of the work of art as a fixed, optical, flat thing to be faced or to be approached frontally in some kind of fairly pure gallery or museum setting. We need to, as it were, penetrate or destroy the surface of the work of art in any way that would seem to be worth trying, including making holes in the surface, such as to let the kind of space and the air flow through from one side to the other and around the work. A certain element of building up the surface of the work so that it projected into space, rather like what could be roughly called relief. So it was both a three-dimensional work, but yet not a sculpture. It was a flat object, this kind of thing pioneered by the Russians in the Russian Revolution, of work that projected from the wall, but still had to be approached frontally, as if it belonged to the painting category rather than the sculpture category of work that could be situated in a three-dimensional space. So you have a halfway house here between the flat, purely optical phenomenon and the work which sits on the wall but which can be moved into the viewer's space. And to cut a long story short, Katsumi Nakai's version of this spatialism concept was to use hinges, which, as Yuval has said, can be opened in this way or in that. We're going to talk later about the question of choice, the question, namely, of who decides when to open a hinged flap and when? Who decides how many to open at a given time? Who decides whether a work is best looked at or encountered open or closed? Who is in charge of that interaction with the work exactly? I think this is a question that I'm very unclear about myself. Perhaps we can just explore this. Anyway, then quickly to bring this part of the presentation to a close, there is, you need to hold in mind that Milan in the 1960s was a real center of interest for international collections. Milan being in the north of Italy, don't forget you have many links between the galleries and those in Paris, Dusseldorf and Northern Europe. Very unlike Rome in the south of Italy, where there's a more traditional culture, always looking back to some extent to a classical past. So Milan is the city of experiment, and much more so, of course, than the nearby Venice. Well, the rest, I think, will become clear as we go on. Just to mention one thing, that having mentioned America, the critical situation, that is the atmosphere of theory and reflection by critics relating to abstract expressionism in America and later kind of minimal art, is quite important to all of this. And although I speculated on this question in the catalogue, it's probably too much to say that Nakai himself was very well clued into this problem. But America remained, for most or many artists in the West, a kind of dream or a kind of center, a powerhouse of new work and bold experimental work right through the later 60s into the 70s and beyond. And maybe it still does today. So the idea of having an ambition to go to America was not altogether strange. However, and I will finish here, when later in his career Nakai was asked whether he wanted to go to America finally at the end of his career, he said, actually no. He was happy not to have been. Did he want to go? Not really. With the slight qualification, if there's one place that I would have liked to go, it would be Las Vegas. Now, why Las Vegas? I find this quite interesting. We don't know why, but my speculation is that it has something to do with the glitzy panels, possibly the kind of special, shallow, but colorful culture of Las Vegas. I have no idea. I think that would probably do for me, but I think what we're concerned about this evening is the, as it were, the kind of the hybrid context, if you like. An artist who, having been born in Japan, he traveled to America, he also went to Paris, Athens, Rome, even to London in, I think, 1964, And I'm told, I asked his daughter, what did you do in London? What galleries did you go to? The answer was, he didn't want to go to the galleries. And I said, well, what did you do? And I was told that the one place he did want to go to, and did go to, was, believe it or not, Stonehenge. Now, make sense of that if you can. But he did seem to have some interest in the deep cultural roots of European culture, not only Stonehenge, but ancient sites in southern Italy too. There we are. I think we'll leave it here, and I'll hand over to Lena to put us all right.
Yeah, so I think to add to this context of Italy and of, you know, the kind of more Western art scene, there are three contexts that I think are quite interesting as maybe even subconscious influences or just at least context of his work. And so the first is Osaka and the Kansai area in Japan, which is quite a particular area. So Osaka is the third biggest city in Japan now, and this whole area of Kansai and Osaka in Japan is associated with performance, theatricality, with the media. So now if you see all these kind of comedy shows on Japanese television, or even things that you might know from the 80s, I think it's in English called Takeshi's Castle or so, Takeshi Kitano, you know, kind of funny, crazy Japanese game shows. Most of that comes from Osaka. If you watch any kind of fun game shows and comedy shows on Japanese television, they speak in an Osaka dialect. It's all from Osaka. So it's really the area of performance, of the theater, of comedy, and there is interesting that he was interested in Las Vegas actually, because Dotonbori, the area where there are all the theaters in Osaka, has all this kind of almost Las Vegas vibe of, you know, theater and like blitzy lights and a lot of entertainment. So there is a level of playfulness and a level of performance, which I think is interesting as a background when we look at these works. Tekkeikai was mentioned, so the name of this artist group. That's also really funny when we think about it in this context of Osaka, because tekkei, so tetsu is kind of iron, kei is the chicken or cockerel, kai is the group. But with Japanese, if you just say tekkei kai, people don't really know what it means, because you don't know which Chinese characters you use. So there is this kind of subtle comedy element. So a subtle playfulness that I find, in a lot of what I read about him. And then, of course, Gutai was mentioned. So Gutai as an art group that was founded in 1954, and that was actually active for about 20 years with different members. So there were different generations of Gutai artists. Performance was an important part, just really, radical, experimental work that was really trying to break with everything that happened in Japan before the war. Because we should also remember that the kind of Japanese art scene before the war or just after the war is quite conservative, because the whole concept of art education was brought to Japan. So students at art school would have to decide if they wanted to study Japanese-style painting or Western-style painting. And for Western-style painting, they would literally copy Renaissance paintings or Rembrandt paintings, etc. So that's the kind of system that's in place. And then there are these artists that break out of all of that. So that, as a background. So Kansai as an area where people were quite brave, quite experimental, quite generally have a good sense of humor as well. And I think that humor as a background is quite important to understand the work, as opposed to, the more serious side of things in Tokyo. So very often when you go to Japan, people would be quite proud when they come from the Kansai area to Tokyo. They would still keep their dialect, which people from other regions usually don't do. So there is a level of kind of confidence also. So that's as one kind of context, just to describe the background that he would have come from. Then if we think about the late 1950s and early 1960s, there is, which was already mentioned, this this willingness of Japanese artists, or this desire of many artists to go abroad, to go to the US. And also there were American artists or other European artists who came to Japan. So it's not completely isolated as we might think of Japan. So Cage visited for the first time in 1962. Of course, he also went to the Kansai area. He visited Kyoto. Robert Rauschenberg visited in the early 1960s. American pop art was really big in Japan. There was this whole kind of Tokyo pop movement. Kusama moved to New York in 1958. Yoko Ono moved in 1957 and then actually returned to Tokyo in 1964. So it is a time when people are kind of moving around, and when, you know, many Japanese artists wanted to leave Japan and this kind of more conservative background. And the third context that I think is interesting is this whole context of folding and unfolding, if we think about that in Japanese culture. And also the aesthetic that we see in these works, how they kind of relate to some Japanese culture. And I think there are multiple references here. So one, of course, that we might think of is origami, so the you know, kind of tradition of folding paper, which came in the 700s to Japan, which at the beginning was very ceremonial and linked to Shinto, actually. So interesting, the background that, you know, the father was a priest. But later on then became also just really a kind of a pastime and a playful activity. And the 1950s is actually interesting because at that time there was a kind of origami revival, and it became part of kindergarten curriculum, for example. So, you know, many children would just do this and learn this. And there was a big book that came out in 1954 called Atarashi Origami Geijutsu, so the new art of origami. But the other thing is kirie, so the art of paper cutting. So when I see those works over there, for example, you know, that reminded me of this very kind of meticulous cutting, the symmetry. You know, you cut into paper, then you open it up. I think there are, you know, so there is this kind of cultural background as well. And then, of course, the culture of wrapping. You know, I mean, in Japan, everything is wrapped so beautifully. When you buy something in a shop, it's always wrapped. Books are wrapped, actually, as well. When you go to the bookshop, they wrap everything. So people, when you then read the book on the underground, so people don't see what you're reading. Then, of course, the obento lunchbox, usually very, you know, prepared very beautifully. We often wrap it. And then something that I thought was really interesting, considering the religious background, there is also the opening and closing of the butsudan. And the butsudan is this kind of shrine altar that you have at home, where you have a little Buddha inside, or in addition to Buddha or without Buddha, you have a photograph of your ancestors. And so you open this shrine when you want to pay your respects. You put, you know, like an incense there, or maybe, you know, some sake, or some cigarettes, or some fruit, some rice, whatever you want to kind of give to the ancestors. So it's something that you have in your home, like most or many Japanese people and families have that at home. And you open it up for that function, and then you close it again. And in terms of the size, for some of those works, I thought it's actually about the same size as well. And yeah, so hinges is something that I think in the Japanese context we really associate more with furniture rather than doors, because of course traditionally doors would be sliding doors rather than, you know, doors where you have hinges on. The bright colors just reminded me of some Japanese pop art at the time, so I think that's also something that probably, you know, in that Italian context is quite unusual, but in Japan in the 1960s there would have been some works that were using these colors. And then this whole concept of things being in flux and in constant change, that of course is also very, you know, traditional Japanese philosophical context. The context of the in-between, the ma, so maybe something is not completely closed and not completely open. That's, yeah, I mean, you know, very traditional Japanese. And it was very interesting that you said that he titles the works when he returns to Japan as hiraku, I think you said, because that actually is a little bit different to unfolding. It means opening, so in a much wider sense. And I thought that's actually also interesting for us to think about, you know, what does opening mean and what does unfolding mean? Because unfolding obviously suggests the folding and then unfolding. That's different to opening. So yeah, there are loads of interesting contexts, I think, to consider when looking at his work.
Amazing, thank you. Wow. We should rewrite the catalog, Brandon. I'll say one more thing before we move to Jeff, and I want to say that it's interesting what you're talking about covering. This show, hanging this show proved very difficult because these works, as you mentioned also earlier, Brandon, don't ever have a right way of being hung. Because if they're open, you don't see them closed, and if they're closed, they're not open, and they can be open part way, and that playfulness feels so integral to them. And actually, according to records and Cardazzo, the gallerist who accompanied him, these used to at first be allowed for the viewers to play with. And that was the first stated that you'd come to the show, you can open and close. And to be honest, we've had some visitors to this show who were tempted to do the same. And it's clearly inherent to the work, but it does put you in a very difficult position. So do you put them, when we've had them all open, they're so exciting and celebratory, but they also do not show this side of them. And I think tonight we had this decision of closing everything, maybe also keeping them in check for this conversation and giving kind of but there is something, this show looks completely different when it's closed, and it doesn't feel like the same artist at all. That transition is very interesting, but I hope we can talk at some point, and I'm pointing to you, Jeff, a bit, about exactly what does it mean to leave that problem to the audience, or to further generations, to be left with works that don't have a prescription on how they have to exist. But what we've asked Jeff to do today is that's because we were thinking a little bit about Nakai in a contemporary context, and that's something we often do when we try to do shows and to do exhibitions of historical artists, that it always feels like it's becoming, it easily becomes nostalgic. And funnily, as I said to you earlier, I think Jeff and Nakai have very little in common, in sense of feeling like they are part of some trajectory or tradition or come from the same place or anything. And yet there's a huge correlation and interest in some of the questions that I think Nakai is dealing with and you're dealing with today in your work. So we've asked Jeff, if you don't mind, just giving a bit of an introduction to your work and maybe thinking through it about ideas here in the show.
Yeah, sure. My work is very different. I mean, this is now for something completely different, I think. But it's been interesting being asked to look at the work and think about it and find relations. And, you know, looking at it through a different lens, looking at my own work, I kind of see, oh, there are these overlaps that perhaps do pertain. So one of which is about location. And I guess we can start with the first slide. But I'm not from here, and I actually am American. I come from Texas, pretty remote part of West Texas called Lubbock, Texas. And this is a picture I took on the outskirts of my city a few years ago in the winter. It's a big, flat, vast plain, all cotton farming. This is winter, so you can see a little bit of cotton, but it's incredibly flat, and you can just literally see for miles, very uninterrupted. And this is a landscape I kind of grew up seeing as a child. And if we go to the next slide, what's interesting to me when I lived there, it was the most boring place, and I couldn't wait to get away from it. But somehow the farther you get away from it, you know, the more interesting it becomes. And this is a satellite image of basically exactly the same space, the same place. But the way the agriculture works is that they have these sort of single point irrigation that tap into the aquifer to water the cotton. And, you know, so when you get in the plane, it actually looks vastly different. And something about that duality I find quite interesting. So I sort of point that out. And it's always a place I feel like I can't escape being from, and it's kind of found its way into my work. If we go to the next slide. So this is a work, it's weird, I just added this at the last minute, basically, because thinking about Nakai working as a part of the Gutai group, you know, and about how this kind of expressive, brushy kind of way of working, I was like, well, actually, I had this period where I was working with these very big brushes and making paintings that were, you know, this is about 7 feet tall, before I came to England. And so this is a painting that actually, at the time, this is just around the time I was in graduate school, I went to I studied in Texas, and then I studied in Alabama, and I was in the Deep South for a few years. So, but I was bringing the soil from these cotton fields and taking and mixing with pigment and actually make both a combination of oil paint but also with soil. So these are kind of big, sort of muddy, I've almost made my own pigment, but so the connection to the land, I guess, has always sort of been there in some way like that. But so that's a painting I made before I came to London. And then if we go to the next slide, this is pretty different. It's a few years later, but I met an English artist in Texas, and who I moved over and later married, and that was how I arrived here. And I sort of got here in the late 90s. I actually arrived for the first time on the day of the Sensation show at the Royal Academy, over there, yeah. And so it was weird. It was like apex, you know, like peak YBA. And so I think that I didn't come to make these sort of paintings until a little bit later, but I do feel like the influence of being here, changing my work. I lived in Shoreditch and spent a couple of years moving into a place and then started using as a studio. But I was interested in the idea of the found object, about like making paintings. I really wanted to work without using a brush, without having a sort of signature style of working. So these paintings are all made by just finding a box on the street, splaying it out, and then dipping each side into paint. So each side would be painted and would run off, and the next day be dry, and I could turn it and make a different paint a different plane. So next slide. So this is basically these boxes, you know, it worked out they had 9 planes, so I could almost make a painting in 9 days. And it felt urban. It kind of felt like London. It felt like the colors of, you know, the YBAs in a way. I mean, it was, you know, I looked at artists even before I came here, but it was, it was just a very simple way of working. And I like the way, for me, it was like, oh, this kind of connects back to someone like Donald Judd, or, you know, the idea of like boxes on a wall, and how simple could it be. But it's funny thinking about Nakai and sort of folding and unfolding, and, you know, just when you take something and splay it out, it hangs really nicely on a wall, funny enough. So if we go. So this goes a few years later, I had this idea about like not just working with things that were sort of incidental, but were more, I guess, purposeful or meaningful to me. And so this is, I actually got together all the books that I had gone back to Texas and shipped to London from way back in the day. So these are my sort of formative art books. And so that sort of library of 40 or 50 books I took and folded, wrapped in a piece of Japanese paper, and then did this thing where I would dip each side into ink and then leave it to dry. And then eventually, once all the sides were covered, I would open the book. If we go to the next. So this is kind of in the process. This is, you can just about make out the text, I think, reading through. But I would use this kind of non-stick, low-tack tape. So fold these up, wrap them, and then protect my book. Maybe we go to the next one. So this is like, you know, I'd have this little piece of tape that would say GRT, you know, which so that I knew once this was a kind of blank canvas what it was. And that, so, you know, these things, let's go to the next one. Oh, I thought there was a finished version. Okay, so this is like another version. So, well, yeah, keep going. Yeah, and maybe one more. So this is like, it's funny, so some of the books that I had, so this is a book, Shark Infested Waters, which was a kind of compendium of all the YBAs, you know, written by Sarah Kent, which I'd been reading in Texas, and so it's the kind of thing that, you know, this index of I called this series Biblio, and it's almost like a personal bibliography of my own, you know, my own index of what sort of formed me as an artist, I think. Let's go to one more. So this is the sort of final version. So funny enough, I fix things, you know, I don't leave any ambiguity about how I will show them. I think I always finish the work, and so these get framed, but they're not, there is like a little bit of there's a little bit of dimension to them. So, you know, these paperworks particularly, so that float in a frame, but they have the memory of this folding, and sometimes that's different. Sometimes often I folded these all, wrapped them myself, but I got to where I would ask someone else. I asked my daughter to wrap some up, and then I made a series with those, and they were very different and very random, and sometimes quite crooked. And but you know, let's go to another one. So this is, again, same thing. This is a book by Dave Hickey called The Invisible Dragon, which is his kind of first series of essays. And at some point I decided to add oil paint to these, and so it's always ink in the window pane, as it were, in the center or the cover of the book. But these edges, the spine was done with oil paint. What I didn't know is that the oil travels inside the folds and makes these incredibly ornate patterns sometimes, and so that was a little bit of a shock the first time. But let's go to another one. And usually, I mean, I remember opening these and thinking these are a disaster, but, you know, then growing to like them and accept them. And so there was a process in my work, I think. It's funny, I think about this sort of sense of control, and that's a different thing, I think, that to what Nakai, I think he knows. He actually makes maquettes, I know, and then knows what he wants to make.
I don't think he sees these as maquettes. Interestingly enough, he's actually seizing them as an opportunity, for example, to do gestures he can't do here, like opening, instead of opening like this, to open them on this tangent here, which would be more complicated with hinges, if you see there. And I don't know, but it isn't, yeah.
So those are things that...
He called them collages, and when we tried to find up, for example, there's a work behind this screen that resembles maybe a little bit the work at the top, but actually doesn't match. So they don't seem to correlate to any specific work at the end of the day. Yeah.
Let's go to the next one. So I started to apply this to making paintings, and this I think my work's become slightly like more traditional from working with Dulux paint on cardboard boxes found in the street to actually now I'm working with oil paints on linen. But slight exception that I have treated the painting as an object. I think that's something that's a real reiteration in all my work, and it's interesting to think about canvases behind these and the idea that, you know, they're you know, this insistence on there being a painting, you know. For me, it's about the idea that a painting is not just the front face, but that where the nails are is also part of it. You know, everything you sort of see that's not facing the wall. So if we go to the next slide, that painting is part of a series I've been making in the same way. And I've been in this studio in North London off the Holloway Road for about 10 years. And it was formerly a welder's workshop. And it was a pretty ugly building with these burglar bars and things welded, lots of steel welding on to go with it. But I started putting the paintings outside, and you know, just started with one or two, and then built up and started to think about the way it just kind of mimics something like Mondrian's studio in New York, or you know, in some ways like some of Peter Doig's paintings of these kind of colorful stone houses, or outsider artists, self-taught artists that I'd met in the South that just hung work on the outside. What's happened is that not only I'm kind of now recording time as well as this sort of shape of the painting. So if we go forward, you know, they're outside through all weather and they start to change, and so I leave them out for a significant amount of time, 2, 3, 4, 5 years sometimes. So if we go one more. So at some point the works either start to become compromised and I think I need to move them in, or I think the idea of the found object, I'm always like looking at them. They're sort of the background of the studio, of the environment of the studio, until something about one or two of them might become interesting to take them in. So this has been distressed with like a rain that's come out of a gutter, or sometimes there's things with snail trails, or animals, there's animal activity or pollution or whatever. So they're kind of like a corrupted monochrome of sorts. So they're these things that start out quite pure and then take on some other effect, you know, some other sort of, I don't know, they're changed over time. So let's go. And then there are some that I have pushed back towards being like this, in this space, like the boxes were that are between painting and sculpture. And these to me, these still sort of relate back to almost like those fields in Texas, this idea of like color field. These I originally thought of as like furrows, you know, the way you would have a plane that's sort of folded or broken in a certain way. So let's go to the next one. I realize they're all very symmetrical. You know, this is something I was looking at this way of like dealing, not always with Nakai, but most of the time, you know, there's this thing that's like, I don't know, I try to keep it very simple, not get too complicated about it, but let's go to the next one. And so these are all, when I take these, I take them off the frames. What I haven't said is I've obviously taken them off the wooden stretcher frames. And because I treat these linens, these are kind of antique linens that I use, and I use rabbit skin glue. It's so old-fashioned, you know. And then the oil paint. They have this kind of rigidity. They're kind of quite firm. So in the first time I came to fold them, you know, you realize that they can actually fold quite neatly. I actually use an iron on them sometimes, or just press them out. So these sort of sit out off the wall, maybe 5, 6, 7 centimeters, something like that. And then the idea of like folding, if we go to the next one, you know, there's sort of other iterations. I realized that, you know, if you fold a painting like that, you almost get something that's like an umbrella shape, basically. And so this is the idea of just taking one of these linens and really just like opening a tin of black Dulux paint and just putting it inside, and then, you know, lifting it out just to see what's, I don't know, all my work I think is really reductive. It's like, what's the simplest way to make an image, you know? So that's really kind of what's happened here. Yeah, here's another. Some of them start to take on this slightly more pictorial, I think, and certainly perspectival imagery, which is something that when I went to art school and tried to learn, you know, looked at one-point perspective, I kind of knew it from the back of my car, the car when I grew up, you know, this idea of fields. Okay, let's do. So, and just to kind of come full circle, I had this idea for a while that I was making these paintings for the last several years in London and making them in a certain way, and I had the idea to what would it be like to go back to where I came from and try to see what would happen if I took paintings there or put paintings outside. And so with the help of my sister, who's still in Lubbock, Texas, I, you know, had this, just rang her up and said, I got this kind of strange idea, and, you know, bear with me. But I wanted to put some paintings out in a cotton field, you know, outside of town. You think you could, you know, is that something you could think about? And she said, oh, I'll ask Jason. And I was like, you know, she was like, oh, my best friend's brother, he's got a big cotton farm, and he'll, you know, we should go talk to him. So incredibly, it was very easy, you know. So, and the amazing thing was Jason has this storage, unit. It's basically a Santa Fe railway car that a few years before he painted silver. So rather than having all these logos on it and all that, it's the most amazing sort of neutral silver vehicle, if you will, and I said, do you mind if I put paintings on the outside of this? Oh, you know, it's fine, you know. So I did make these 10 paintings that are all about 2 meters high, and I did all this during lockdown. It's funny, I started the first one, I had an assistant, and the two of us were, you know, each one of these requires pouring out paint into a big vat and then putting it face down. And I had help in March of 2020, and then everything went into lockdown, and then I devised a pulley system to do all the rest of them. So I did them all by myself, and then they just sat there for a long time. I didn't get until 2022. I did go out last summer and hung them on the side of this railway car, and then left them there for a year, and went back this summer, and so. And I was kind of quite shocked to see how distressed they were. But I knew the sun, and the sun was quite. I knew how windy and sunny it was. But it was quite It was just like just in time. I literally got back like 1 year to the day back to take them down, which worked out really well. But some of them were starting to get really distressed and to tear apart. So I was going to say, if we just go back one for a second, if you look at like the painting fourth to the end, that sort of bright blue one, and then let's go forward, you can see where it is there. The pink especially. I knew pink was a kind of fugitive pigment, you know, this idea of red and how it changes. But let's go, and then one more. And so this is, I've got them back in London. They're in my studio now. I'm sort of working through them. And so this is the, one of the 10. And, you know, with these, and let's go one more. This is my last slide, is these are the first 3 of the 10 that I've got. I sort of end up having to conserve my own work now, so I have to take them off, and I put a backing on them and kind of meticulously cut and iron onto them. But so I think these are, you know, this is very different work, and it's very distressed and changed. But I don't know. I think it has a memory of being folded or being painted or being, you know, this idea of planes of color. You know, there are certain things that I think there are combinations. And it's interesting to me to think about like Nakai being in, you know, who you are when you go to a place, and how being there changes you. What do you adapt and become part of that place, and how much so do you go back to? And that's what's, I think, interesting about what is Japanese about the work, what is Italian about the work, you know? And I'm sure we'll kind of go on. You know, I have some thoughts about, which we were sort of talking about before, about, you know, what things he was looking at, or, you know, some to do with painting, maybe others to do with design in the city and things like that. But yeah, but I should stop there.
No, thank you so much. Well, I feel like we should end here, but I know we can't, so. So I'll say one thing before also, that if anybody has any questions, now would be a good time to think, because in a moment or two I'll also allow so that some people can ask things from the audience. I do want to ask a few things, and if any of you has anything also. One of them is directly taking off from what you're saying. I was suddenly caught by the term color field, which suddenly seemed like such a great pun. Yeah, but I kind of missed it in all of our conversations until now, so I feel a bit like delayed. Of course, color field painting. Yes, that's what it was meant to be. But I wonder what you're thinking about a few things. One of them being this exactly loss of control. And I wonder to what extent, I suppose, what I keep holding as a tension that I can't resolve, both, by the way, with Nakai, but definitely with your work, is the place between a conceptual gesture and one that has to do with painting from a very painterly place. And it's interesting, you started off by saying that you've abandoned or wanted to abandon the brushstroke, the stylistic trait, yet these seem to be, to some extent, maybe that's the question, to what extent are they random and dictated by a time span and a certain conditions, almost in the conceptual tradition of doing that? A painting exposed, you know, a purple painting in this shade exposed for 24 days and this, and to what extent this is an aesthetic exploration as well, this is a painterly exploration in other terms for you?
I don't think I knew in the beginning. I think having come up with a way of working, a kind of method of making a painting, tipping a painting, you know, that felt kind of original, at least at the moment. You know, there's a funny thing about, in the background, thinking about Nakai and myself and maybe any artist, I think the Western tradition, the avant-garde idea about originality is, I think that can't be forgotten, how you, and this is a slight aside, but just saying that the idea that, like, if you are doing something that feels like no one else is doing, that is like paramount, you know, rather than being traditional where you're trying to like copy something or do something in the style of, I think. And I feel like, you know, it's often I think about making a space, finding a space for yourself, a niche that's unexplored, or unexplored enough that you can do something, you know? So I guess the way that method that I'm using of painting, I have explored different iterations of that, whether that's about describing an object, a very specific object, and within that, if you hold something to dry, it has droplets of ink that build up, and then later you can this thing is revealed to you. Or with the boxes, you have droplets of paint at the bottom. I think it's interesting you're talking about the number of days and putting things out. I'm very much for this kind of not having that much control. I'm more interested in setting something in motion and then seeing what happens, And it was interesting reading about him being John Cage coming, and I wondered, for me that would be an interesting thing, the sort of randomness of Cage and what that meant all the way through. But I don't know that I see it. These feel more premeditated and less. There is an interesting thing about the hand. There's no brushstroke here. It feels very smooth, and it's all completely uniform. So it's interesting his painterliness, whether the idea that there's a canvas inside there, but it's more, it does feel like an object that's encasing it.
They're not in fact canvases, are they? I think I'm right in saying they're not in fact canvases.
Okay.
They're boards, right?
No, some of them are.
Some of them are canvases?
Some of them are. This is a canvas. This is a canvas behind it that's exposed. And also to say one thing about the painterly gesture. This painting, for example, the blue one that looks like an Yves Klein in the back, once you open it, you discover a very expressive brushstroke suddenly, which is a bit surprising and a bit catching you off guard because it doesn't feel Nakai-like. But he seems to be very conscious also of the types of paint he's using. So you could see that some of the paintings are shiny and are using clearly oil, some are acrylic. He treats usually wood with acrylic and oil with and canvas with oil, but then in other cases he would suddenly paint with oil and give this shininess to the object. But it's certainly interesting to think, and I guess this is where I wanted to ask you, Lena. You spoke of so many various contexts within the visual culture and the aesthetic culture of Japan, but I'm kind of curious to imagine if he would make these in Japan within the context of the artistic community, the contemporary post-war artistic community of Japan in those years, or in Osaka specifically. As you say, Japan is maybe a more complex entity, but how do you see him in that context? How do you envision him? Yeah,
that's such a tricky question because I don't know. I think the work is very unique anyway, so I think it would have been quite unique in Japan as well. The two-dimensionality in terms of the paint I find quite interesting as well, because of course that also maybe links to some kind of pop art prints at the time. So aesthetically, it kind of, it does make sense in Japan as well. But it's such a hypothetical question, right? What would have happened if he had stayed, if he would have created these kind of works, or if there is a lot of, Italian inspiration there. Some of the Gutai artists were really going into the canvas and kind of were quite experimental. So I guess it doesn't only, you don't need to meet Fontana in order to kind of, be quite radical. There were some artists who actually, Gutai artists, who did very similar things to Fontana, saying that they didn't even know about his work. So some tendencies of kind of really questioning the canvas and the painting, I think, were definitely there. And then maybe also, in a way, there is more of an openness, ironically, just because there isn't that long tradition of painting in this kind of on canvas, like in the West. So, even the term art was a term that was brought, in the kind of Meiji periods in the late 19th century, after Japan was forced to open its borders. Because before, the division between kind of art and crafts wasn't really there as much. So I think that's actually, as a background, also quite interesting when we look at the work, because of course it's very crafty in a way.
Very much, and actually there are several of his works that behave like furniture, and he distinguishedly explained when an object is a furniture and when an object is an art object. So he made these few cabinets that are in so many ways unusable, but they open up and they behave like cabinets and so on, or a chair that he would, but this wasn't, it wasn't a design chair. He later actually conceived and thought of possibly making a chair that would be then reproduced. But there is something there where he goes in that tradition, and obviously there is a question of material here. So Brandon, I wonder if you had the use of plywood, hinges.
The one thing I would add about gutai here for people who are not completely familiar with this formation of artists is that there seems to be an emphasis on in gutai theory and practice on, probably best described as breaking something and breaking it with the body. So you collapse something, you smash something, you shatter something, but you do it with a certain intelligence, a certain delicacy, a certain panache, a certain humor even, I'm not sure, but possibly so. But these works these works with the hinges, I think, establish the distance between Nakai and gutai, because they're very carefully constructed. They have certain revelatory qualities. They open to start with rather than close or reveal the damage done to them, as Jeff does with his work sometimes. I noticed too, Jeff, with your work, there's a fascinating kind of part played by the edges of the work, especially the bits which are, as it were, not central to the work as an optical painting, but suddenly become interesting when they are displayed in this way. So there are very many complicated kind of variations on the kind of ontological question of what a work of art is materially, optically, physically, everything else. I mean, I found the question of hinges very, very intriguing, because we couldn't find, and maybe people here could find, and I think we should ask people to give us their ideas, where else do you find hinges in modern and recent art? We know a bit about Rauschenberg in that respect. There is a strong, there's a big discussion to be had about folding and the Baroque, which some people will know about in relation to the idea of the what the French call pliage, or folding, and its connection with the gestures in Baroque painting, where you have the limbs of the body in the well-known and very difficult book by Gilles Deleuze called The Fold, basically on Baroque aesthetics. You have one fascinating observation in connection with a painting by El Greco, in which the knee in the painting is folded right back at the back underneath the body and becomes invisible apart from the heel. But it's an extreme gesture, and he's kind of reminding us, if things were not already obvious, that the body itself is a folding armature of possibilities and movements and choices. It's complicated.
Jeff, you wanted to say something?
I was going to say Lygia Clark, for instance. I think there's these kind of constructions that are, that have some of those concerns. But someone we talked about.
No, it's interesting because we found sporadic examples throughout histories, not so much a tradition in this sense, possibly not within modern art. But if you
look at a Renaissance altarpiece, which has tripartite altarpiece with two side panels or even more, and hinges in the middle, you kind of know somewhere in your brain that the hinges themselves, as metal pieces, are not really part of the work. They're not part of the optical part of the work. They're there as rather like a frame. The frame is not part of the work, and yet the frame, in a curious way, is essential to the work.
Yeah. I understand there's some questions, so I'll give an opportunity if there's anybody. Yes?
Good evening, everyone. Hi, thank you so much. I wanted to ask Jeffrey a question. It's more of a practical one. I was just wondering, how do you conserve your paintings? Because, like, obviously in Texas, the climate's quite dry, so it's a bit easier. But here in London, it's very humid. What if there is mold on them or something? Like you said, you iron them, but afterwards,
Yeah,
it doesn't really prevent mold from expanding on them.
Yeah,
so,
well, I probably should get some expertise, if I'm honest with you, because I just sort of do my best. I do think, it's funny, I'm asking more questions about this, and I think that, like, I do, because sometimes there's a lot of mildew on the works. That's the curious major difference in works in London. Surprise, surprise, that, you know, the moisture and the rain and all that they do mildew. That actually gives them a patina and a color. But, yeah, it's maybe not ideal. I do worry a little bit about that. But the ones in Texas, that's kind of not an issue. But yeah, I've just been trying to hold them together as best and keep the shape of them, you know. So yeah.
Hello, thank you. It's a question for Jeff again. It's around technicalities. I'm actually very interested in the methods. Interested in the whole work, but I mean, I just wonder that because when you actually set up your painting to dip them into paint, there must be perhaps a lot of decisions that you have to make around the actual technicality of doing a painting. But then I'm interested in that in contrast with the fact that you then leave the painting out there completely at their own, they just take a life on their own, according to that. So it's that kind of relationship between the actual, do you have to make a lot of decisions as to how you do them, or I'm just interested in the actual process of being.
I make the decisions in the studio when I make the painting, what the color combinations might be or what, that sort of thing. And then putting them outside, I kind of just let them go. I've actually become a lot more relaxed about the whole process, and so some I've let go a really long time till they almost just become a fragment, taking them apart is really like, they look like they could be hundreds of years old or something. Things that I thought I would just end up throwing away, but so now it's a process of like, I've learned to just try, even with the biblio, the dipped books, it's just like trying to have this, just thinking that maybe nothing is a mistake, everything is kind of up for grabs and is worth considering, and that's kind of refreshing because, I don't want to get too tight about the way I'm working, so it's about, so it's just in the way of leaving them out. I'm leaving them out for longer and longer, and more is happening. They're getting more and more distressed, my paintings, but it's kind of interesting. It should be said, it's kind of a way of marking what's going on outside, in a bigger kind of global way as well. They're kind of like taking on, these ones that have been in Texas, it's kind of so extreme, it just feels like it's become part of the work, so yeah, but anyway, that's
no. So I'm conscious that we're way past our time, but I'm going to say one more thing before we conclude, and then I think we have some drinks and we can all talk, and also they're not allowed to leave, so you can ask them a lot more questions. There was one thought that stayed with me, particularly since, Brandon, you mentioned Las Vegas. And that was, this moment in time, the 1960s, the 1970s, when we're thinking about Las Vegas, there's no better reference than the very famous book, Learning from Las Vegas, that comes out, the outcome of an architectural research that starts in the late 1960s by Dennis Scott and Robert Venturi and ends by this wonderful publication in 1972, looking at these two, primarily looking at Las Vegas Strip, this architectural model that seemed to be just kind of a funny, pleasureful thing as a serious architectural proposition, something that relates to the notion of postmodernism in this moment. And Venturi and Scott really suggest two models. They suggest that to kind of think about maybe the modernist model of architecture through the duck, The duck is a building that looks like a duck because that's the function that it needs to produce. In this case, they're using an image of a building in Long Island that actually looks like a duck and was built by an egg farmer who was selling eggs from that building. But the function, the form follows function kind of methodology lies at its core. What happens in Vegas is the opposite, and they call it the decorated shed. You make a little simple box, it has to be square like every other shed, and then you can put a sign of a duck on top of it, or a hand like this that opens with its fingers or something. But I actually, looking at Nakai, can't really pin him down into one or the other. And I think these paintings are at once decorated sheds because they have this exactly this well-behaved, basic, rectangular, monochrome surface that they can assume, that from which they can give us everything. But they're also extremely functional and opening. And I think that tension that he contains has such a beautiful prospect to the idea that he never went to America. And when he was asked, where would you go? He said, Vegas. I find it kind of a, maybe he didn't intend to it, but a very profound point of view on what he was actually doing and what he was actually exploring in his painting. So I want to thank you three very much for coming here this evening and sharing a huge amount of expertise with us, and for everybody that came tonight, and as always to Alma and Daniela for making all of this possible. And please join us for drinks. Thank you.